Hello and welcome, Pen Pals, to our next presentation of Walt Disney, an American original. Today we will be reading Section 2, Chapter 9. Last time we started Section 2, Chapter 8, where we became aware of Mickey Mouse for the first time and the struggles therein to find this first talkie. Today we're going to start in 1934. By 1934, the Mickey Mouse Club had 1 million members, and Mickey was known in every civilized country of the world. Douglas Fairbanks Sr. ingratiated himself to Polynesian natives by showing them Mickey Mouse cartoons, and Mary Pickford declared Mickey her favorite star. In London, Madame Tussauds Museum enshrined Mickey in wax. Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote to Walt from the White House, "My husband is one of the devotees of Mickey Mouse. Please believe that we are all of us most grateful to you for many delightful evenings." A rare, discordant note was heard from German censors who banned a Mickey Mouse cartoon because the wearing of German military helmets by an army of cats which oppose a militia of mice is offensive to national dignity. Caveat here, I don't think many people care what the Nazis thought. The craze for Mickey Mouse brought a new and important source of income to the Disney enterprise. Use of Oswald's likeness had been granted to a few manufacturers, largely for the publicity value. Walt first realized the financial possibility of licensing when he was in New York for negotiations with Pat Powers in late 1929. He recalled later that a man called at his hotel and offered $300 in cash for permission to imprint Mickey Mouse on school writing tablets. "As usual, Roy and I needed money, so I took the 300, Walt said. I have another book here called Understanding Disney. And there's one thing that Walt and the Disney franchise did that no others were able to do. This is not in the book, this is just my observation. To use the power of the franchise to make Mickey Mouse the most recognized symbol in the world and then monetize that awareness. Just that's where the power really came into. More offers arrived. On February 3rd, 1930, Roy signed the first contract for merchandising, granting the George Borchfeld Company of New York the right to manufacture and sell figures and toys of various materials, embodying designs of comic mice known as Minnie and Mickey Mouse, appearing in copyrighted motion pictures. Disney would receive 2.5% royalty on items selling for 50 cents or less, 5% for more expensive products. The first license made by Borchfeld went to a Swiss firm for the manufacture of Mickey and Minnie handkerchiefs. After Mickey Mouse began to capture the nation's affection, Walt assigned the prolific Ub Iwerks to devise a comic strip for newspapers. While Ub was at work on the strip, an offer for syndication came from the Hearst agency, King Features. Ub prepared several specimens until Walt was satisfied, and the Mickey Mouse comic strip made its appearance on January 13th, 1930. Ub's assistant, Win Smith, drew the Mickey Mouse comics for 3 months. Then it was taken over by Floyd Gottfredson, who continued with the strip until 1975. Walt reviewed Gottfredson's work for the first year and a half, then lost interest. Sometimes on trips, he mailed Gottfredson copies from newspapers with a comment such as, "There's too damn much junk in this strip," prompting the cartoonist to remove the clutter. The Mickey Mouse strip proved a big seller for King Features, which began syndicating Mickey and Silly Symphonies comics in colors for Sunday supplements on January 10th, 1932. In 1932, an energetic Kansas City advertising man named Herman K. Kamen telephoned Walt with proposals about how to merchandise Mickey Mouse and the other Disney characters. Walt and Roy had been dissatisfied with their New York and London agents, and they invited Kamen to California for a discussion of his ideas. The Disneys were impressed, especially with Kamen's emphasis on the quality of the merchandise to bear the Disney imprint. And on July 1st, 1932, Kamen signed a contract to represent the company. One of his first deals was with a baking concern for 10 million Mickey Mouse ice cream cones. The salesmanship of Mickey Mouse produced seemingly miraculous results. Kamen licensed the Lionel Corporation, pioneer and manufacturer of toy electric trains, for the merchandising of a Mickey and Minnie wind-up handcar with a circle of track for the price of $1. Lionel had been hit hard by the Depression and had filed for bankruptcy, Within 4 months, 253,000 of the handcars had been sold, and the association with Disney was credited by a bankruptcy judge as a major factor in returning Lionel to solvency. The Ingersoll Waterbury Company, makers of timepieces since 1856, had been pushed close to bankruptcy in the early 30s when Cayman licensed the firm to manufacture Mickey Mouse watches. Within weeks, demand for the watches caused the company to raise the number of employees at its Waterbury, Connecticut plant from 300 to 3,000. 2.5 million Mickey Mouse watches were sold within 2 years. Highbrow critics tried to analyze Mickey's popularity in terms of mass psychology. Walt Disney was amused but unimpressed by such intellectualizing. He offered his own explanation. Mickey is a nice fellow who never does anybody any harm, who gets in scrapes through no fault of his own, but always manages to come up grinning. He was quick to give credit for much of Mickey's nature to Charlie Chaplin. We thought of a tiny bit of a mouse that would have something of the wistfulness of Chaplin, a little fellow trying to do the best he could. What emerged in Mickey Mouse was more Walt Disney than Charlie Chaplin. The most obvious connection was the voice. The nervous, flustery falsetto, a line of dialogue was often preceded with a shy hee hee hee, was just right for Mickey. It was no easy matter to get color into such an unnatural, limited voice, but Walt managed. No one else could capture the gulping, ingenious, half-brave quality, but the similarity didn't end with the voice. Both Walt and Mickey had an adventurous spirit, a sense of rectitude, an admitted lack of sophistication, a boyish ambition to excel. Both were unashamedly devoted to the ideals of Horatio Alger. Both clung to the old-fashioned notion of remaining steadfast to one sweetheart. The Disney animators recognized this unstated similarity and, when drawing the mouse, often kept in mind, subconsciously at least, the characteristics of Walt. In describing his concept of how the cartoon should appear, Walt called upon his considerable histrionics, acting out each role and each line of dialogue. His depiction of Mickey was so accurate, so inspired, that animators wished they could capture the Disney facial expressions and movements. Once they managed to do so. In one of the cartoons, Mickey had a line the animators couldn't fit a drawing to. "Ah, I'm Mickey Mouse. You've heard of me, I hope." One of the animators asked if Walt would allow himself to be photographed while he recorded the line. Oh, gosh, you don't want to do that, do you?" he replied. They assured him the film would be helpful. Well, Walt replied, if you put the camera in the control booth 75 feet away and don't bother me while I record the line. Okay. The resulting film helped solve the animator's problem. Walt was the devoted guardian of Mickey's integrity. Many times he said in story conferences, Mickey wouldn't do that. He had an unerring sense of detecting when the gagmen were going too far, when they were reaching for comedy business, which would perhaps draw belly laughs, but would be a variance from the naturalness of Mickey's character. That is why Mickey Mouse captured the world's affection, as he had no other cartoon character. He remained himself an enormously likable figure. The success of Mickey Mouse was bringing many changes to the Hyperion studio. The physical plant underwent the first of its many mutations, with additions to the front, side, and rear of the original building, in 1929 and in 1930. New offices were constructed in 1930, and the following year brought the completion of a new two-story animation building and a soundstage. Walt, who had sometimes answered the studio telephone himself in the early years, now had a second-floor office with an oriental rug over planked flooring, stained glass windows, and a handsome wood desk. Studio personnel was expanding rapidly. Veteran animators and storymen left the New York cartoon studios to join the exciting things that were happening at Disney's. Among them were Dave Hand, Rudy Zamora, Tom Palmer, Ted Sears, Burt Gillette, Jack King, and Webb Smith. Burt Lewis took over the music department after Carl Stalling left for another cartoon studio. Frank Churchill joined the studio as a pianist-composer. The infusion of the new talent prompted Walt to set increasingly higher standards for the Mickey Mouse cartoons and the Silly Symphonies. As each new cartoon approached, Walt issued hortatory memos to the staff. A July 20, 1931 message called for suggestions for the 18th Mickey, the Barnyard broadcast. By this time, Mickey and Minnie had been joined by other cast regulars, Pluto the Pup, Horace Horsecollar, and Clarabelle Cow. Walt announced a forthcoming meeting to discuss the cartoon and outline the plot. Story to be built around a barnyard broadcasting idea. Action will center on the efforts of Mickey and his gang trying to broadcast. Probably working piano playing, quartet and goofy numbers, the Swiss yodelers. Mickey could do a solo number on his banjo, and Minnie could play a solo on the harp. The barnyard birds come in and sing, whistle, and chirp while Minnie is playing the harp. Possible to use the same little canary singing all through the broadcast, or use the little barn swallows instead. Clarabelle and Horsecollar could do a dance together or individually. Possibly use Pluto in the story, carrying him in his characteristic dumb style. Could cut back to all the barnyard animals listening in or on their respective radio sets. The chickens in their chicken coop, hens laying eggs to the radio reception, pigs in their pens, dancing, etc. Sheep in the pastures, birds in the trees with their little nests fixed up on like homes, all listening in on their sets. Mickey could be the announcer, could work up a hillbilly act with Clarabelle, Horsecollar, Mickey, and Minnie as the hillbillies. I expect everyone to contribute some ideas to this gag meeting. The ideas must be built around the group of characters as suggested above, and in such a way as to tie them in with the ideas as outlined. Any ideas that you work up to submit at the meeting should be accompanied by small sketches to illustrate the gags. Kindly have such material prepared and ready to hand in at the beginnings of meetings. Supply yourself with a pad and pencil for the purpose of making notes or sketching out any ideas that might present themselves during the course of the meeting. Everyone give this some deep thought and see if we can't come up with a good, peppy meeting. Walt and his artists were developing new techniques for the animation industry. The drawback to cartoon making had always been that the animator could not judge the effectiveness of his work until it was completed and on the screen. In their eagerness to please Walt, his animators developed a process which would permit a preliminary view of what the action would be. As the animators completed key poses, his assistant, or in-betweener, photographed the drawings, developed the print himself, and drawing it on a revolving drum. When enough of the drawings had been completed, the film was spliced into a loop. Then the animator could get a visual impression of how his characters would move. The films were projected in a small, unventilated closet, and thus the place for preliminary review of animation was dubbed the sweatbox. Another important new technique was the storyboard. Animators had long been hampering in story sessions by the necessity of verbalizing what was essentially a visual medium. They brought sketches or created them on the spot, but there was no way to present the complete continuity of what would appear on screen. The storyboard provided that. It was simplicity itself, a large fiber board 4 feet by 8, on which sketches were pinned. Thus, Walt could see at a glance how the action would progress. If scenes were eliminated, they could be unpinned and discarded. Now, new scenes could be added. When the final sequence was decided upon, Walt and his animators could visualize the cartoon from beginning to end. With his staff expanding, Walt Disney began to establish the attitude and modes of operation that would continue throughout his professional career. Not yet 30, he had been in the animation business a dozen years, and his maturity belied his years. Some of his underlings had worked longer in New York cartoons, but all viewed Walt Disney as a leader to be followed and obeyed. Away from the studio, he could indulge in horseplay and be one of the boys, but during work hours, his attitude precluded casual intimacy. He was incapable of small talk. His employees learned not to engage him in the banter that animators use as relief from the tedium of drawing. His mind was too involved with the problems of the moment. A storyline that defied solution, a cartoon that failed to evoke laughs at the preview, an overdue check from Columbia Pictures that threatened next week's payroll. His workers learned not to be offended if he passed them in the hallway without a word. They knew that he was preoccupied with a studio problem. Walt was developing one of those most valuable traits, the ability to recognize a man's creative potential and force him to achieve it. Wilfred Jackson was a raw-boned student from Otis Art Institute when he applied for a job at Disney Studio in 1928. He was so eager to learn animation that he offered to work for nothing, or even paid tuition. He was assigned to help the janitor wash paint off cells. Soon he was animating, drawing a cycle of Minnie running along the riverbank and Steamboat Willie. Each time he proved himself in a new challenge, Walt promoted him to a job of greater responsibility. To Jackson, it seemed that he was being pushed beyond his capacities. But he was so anxious to prove himself to Walt that he tried ever harder. One day, he remarked to Walt, "I'd sure like it if you would let me handle a whole picture myself." Jackson meant that he wanted to animate an entire cartoon. Walt had other ideas. He told Jackson, I've got a lot of loose ends that have been cut out of the Mickeys. Why don't you work up some kind of story that would tie all of them together?" Jackson didn't like being handed bits and pieces of other animators' work instead of creating his own subjects. But he concocted a story with Mickey being stranded on a desert island with a piano. One of the film fragments conveniently had a piano sequence, and dreaming of previous episodes in his life. The result was an entertaining cartoon, The Castaway. Jackson had proved to Walt that he could be a director, which was not what he intended to be, but he recognized later, as Walt had already concluded, that he could not compete with the accomplished animators from New York. He proved to be an expert director, and he remained one for more than 30 years. Ben Sharpstein had worked for Max Fleischer on Happy Hooligan and Out of the Inkwell before coming to work for Walt in 1929. After the New York invasion began in full force, Sharpstein grew discouraged over his ability to keep up with the new animators. Walt recognized Sharpstein's capacity for working with young talent, and he suggested, "We've got to teach these new boys all about animation. You do it." Sharpstein found himself in charge of training the fledgling artists, laying the groundwork for an educational expansion in the mid-30s. After Sharpstein had the program in motion, Walt needed another director. He chose Ben Sharpstein. Walt's work was all-consuming. He seemed to think and talk about nothing else. One evening, Sharpstein met Walt and Lily at a drugstore near the studio. Walt had been thinking about another barnyard adventure for Mickey, and he unburdened himself of the entire plot, enacting in the doorway of the drugstore the roles of cats, pigs, goats, and Mickey himself. No source of story material was overlooked. When Walt received the traffic ticket for speeding, he related the incident to those he met in the studio hallway. With each recounting, the encounter with the law became more embellished until the story proved too good for private tellings. It became the basis for the next Mickey Mouse cartoon, Traffic Troubles. The releasing contract with Columbia Pictures had proved unsatisfactory. Walt and Roy had no quarrel with Harry Cohn, the Hollywood autocrat of Columbia's fortunes, but they felt they were being mistreated by the distribution office in New York. Columbia exacted 35% of all revenue from the cartoons and deducted the costs of prints, transportation, insurance, advertising, etc. The contract provided for Columbia and Disney to take equal shares of the remainder, minus the $7,000 Columbia advance for each cartoon, but nothing ever remained. In 2 years, Columbia released 50 Disney films, and all were charged with a deficit because of the original $50,000 that Columbia had advanced to pay off Powers. With income restricted and costs constantly mounting, Roy Disney sometimes found it difficult to meet the payroll. On one payday, each worker found only a $10 gold piece in his envelope. When Roy complained to his brother about their limited resources, Walt replied, "Don't worry." Even when the nation's banks were closed by President Roosevelt in 1933, Walt refused to share Roy's concerns. "Why should money be so important?" Walt reasoned. "Maybe potatoes will become the medium of exchange. We can pay the boys in potatoes." Walt realized the studio could not produce cartoons at a perpetual loss. The Disney asked Columbia to increase the advance on each cartoon to $1,500. Columbia declined. The veteran producer Sol Lesser had become a friend of the Disneys, and he mentioned their distribution problems to Joseph Schenck, president of United Artists. Schenck told the Disneys, "You are producers. We are a company of producers. We will sell your cartoons on their own. We don't sell any other shorts, so your product won't be released with a bunch of others in block booking. We'll give you $15,000 advance on each cartoon. We also have a close connection with the Bank of America, and we can help you get financing." The proposal was extremely attractive to Walt, not merely because of the terms. United Artists represented the Tiffany's of the movie business. Its partners were Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, Samuel Goldwyn. Walt was especially thrilled at the prospect of being associated with the great Chaplin. The comedian proved to be as much of a fan of the Disney cartoons as Walt had been of Chaplin's comedies. "You're going to develop more? You're getting ahead of your medium," Chaplin told Walt. "But to protect your independence, you've got to do as I have done. Own every picture you make." Walt agreed with the advice. With the association with the United Artists agreed upon, Walt determined to add a new element to animation: color. For years, Walt had been intrigued with the notion of adding color to his cartoons. He had told his technicians to experiment with nitrates and other elements that might provide color on the screen, but nothing proved practical, except for the primitive technique of using blue film stock for night scenes, green for underwater, and red for fire. Then, in the early 1930s, Technicolor developed a method of combining 3 negatives of the primary colors. By 1932, the process had not been perfected for live-action photography, but it could be applied to cartoons. Technicolor showed a test reel to Walt Disney, and he was convinced. Roy wasn't. We'd be crazy to take on the expensive color just after we've made a deal with United Artists, Roy argued. They won't advance us any money for color. Yes, but don't you see, Roy? Walt replied. Maybe United Artists won't give us any more dough, but the pictures will create so much excitement that we'll get longer play dates and bigger rentals. That'll bring back money eventually. Eventually, it'll be years before we see that money, with all the advances that are charged against us already. We can't do it. Roy added his fears that the colors might not stick to the celluloid or would chip off. Walt's answer? Then we'll develop paints that will stick and won't chip. Roy remained unconvinced. He asked others in the studio to dissuade his brother from his disastrous course. Walt heard their arguments and became more certain that color would raise animation to new levels of creativity. He saw color as a means of establishing the silly symphonies. From the beginning, they had been a kind of stepsister to the enormously popular Mickey Mouse series. United Artists had been reluctant to take on the symphonies and did so only when Walt agreed to borrow on his star's name with the billing Mickey Mouse Presents, a Walt Disney Silly Symphony. Walt used his brother's reluctance to evoke a concession from Technicolor. Roy says color is going to cost us a lot of money that we'll never get back, Walt argued. So if we take a chance on it, you've got to assure us that every other cartoon producer isn't going to rush into the theaters with Technicolor. The company agreed to grant Disney 2 years exclusive use of the three-color process. Roy grumbling consented to a contract. Production had been half completed on a silly symphony called Flowers and Trees, an ideal in which plants animated to the music of Mendelssohn and Schubert. Walt ordered the black and white backgrounds repainted and all of the action restaged in color. A special camera was constructed to photograph the colored cells. Roy's fears were confirmed. The dried paint did chip off the celluloid, and colors faded under the hot lights. Walt worked night and day with his laboratory technicians until they developed an adhering paint of stable colors. After the first few scenes had been completed, Walt showed them to a friend, Rob Wagner, publisher of literary magazine in Beverly Hills. Wagner was so impressed that he invited Sid Grauman, impresario of Grauman's Chinese Theater, to see the film. The film lasted only a minute, but Grauman said he wanted Flowers and Trees to open with his next extraction, Strange Interlude starring Norma Shearer and Clark Gable. Walt worked his animators overtime to finish ahead of schedule, and Technicolor speeded the process. When Flowers and Trees appeared at the Chinese in July 1932, it created the sensation that Walt had hoped for. No longer was the silly symphony the neglected half of the Disney product. Flowers and Trees got as many bookings as the hottest Mickey Mouse cartoon. Walt agreed that all future symphonies would be in color. The staff continued to grow, but Walt realized that simply adding more animators and background artists and storymen would not achieve the quality he sought. The veteran animators from New York were good for the slam-bang Mickey Mouse actions, but they didn't understand what Walt wanted in silly symphonies. A new kind of artist was coming to the Disney studio. Unlike the self-made cartoonists from New York, the newcomers were college men or graduates of art schools, drawn to the creative ferment of the Disney studio. Many came to Disney because jobs for artists and architects were as scarce as Cadillacs in Depression era. Walt often remarked that Depression was his greatest ally, assembling a staff of top-flight talent. In 1931, Walt arranged with Chouinard Art Institute in Los Angeles for his artists to attend night classes, with the studio paying the tuition. Since many of the young employees couldn't afford cars, Walt himself drove them downtown to the school, returned to the studio for an evening's work, then picked up the students when the classes were over. When the United Artists contract assured a greater flow of funds into the studio, Walt decided to establish a school at the studio. He asked his Chouinard teacher, Don Graham, to conduct classes 2 nights a week on the studio's soundstage. The first class of the Disney Art School was held on the night of November 15, 1932, with 25 artists in attendance. The number of students grew, especially when others learned that Graham demonstrated motion with the aid of a nude female model. Graham was admittedly unschooled in animation, and some of his students resisted his instruction. Scornful cartoons appeared on the studio bulletin board, depicting Mickey Mouse with an anatomically detailed pelvis. But as time went on, each side learned from the other. Graham and the other teachers realized that animators' peculiar problem of creating characters that were both convincing and entertaining. The animators discovered that their instructors could be helpful in providing keys to the movement of human beings and animals. The art school began to fulfill the function that Walt had designed for it, to develop the talent that would carry animation to heights that only he then envisioned. Animation in Walt Disney Productions took a great step forward with Three Little Pigs in 1933. It began merely as a 36 silly symphony, a variation of the old fable. As Walt pointed out in his initial memo, the original tale could not be followed exactly. In it, the wolf ate the two pigs who made their houses of straw and sticks. Then the industrious pig feasted on the wolf after it fell into boiling water. Walt outlined the basic elements of the story and added, "These little pig characters looked as if they would work up very cute, and we should be able to develop quite a bit of personality in them. Use cute voices that could work into harmony and chorus effects when they talk together. The building of the house holds chances for a lot of good gags. All this action would be set within rhythm and should work out very effectively. Pull quite a few gags of the wolf trying to get into the little houses, and the pig's attempts to get rid of him. Chance for funny ways in which the little pigs attack him, the different household props they would use. The idea of the three pigs having musical instruments give us a chance to work in the singing and dancing angles for the finish of the story. Might try to stress the angle of the little pig who worked the hardest, receive the reward, or some little story that would teach a moral. Someone might have some angles on how we could bring this moral out in a direct way without having to go into too much detail. This angle might be given some careful consideration. For things of this sort woven into the story, give it depth and feeling. It is not our intention to make a straight story out of this. We want to gag it in every way we can and make it as funny as possible. These little pigs will be dressed in clothes. They will also have household implements, props, etc. to work with and not be kept in the natural state. They will be more like human characters. All gags must be handed in by Friday, December 30th at 4 p.m. I expect a big turnout on the story in spite of the Christmas." Walt's choice of men to work on Three Little Pigs was inspired. To draw the pigs themselves, he selected Fred Moore, a brilliant, intuitive animator who had arrived at the Disney studio in 1930 with a set of sketches on shirt laundry cardboards. He was only 18, but soon he was animating alongside the veterans. Moore invested each pig with a distinct personality and drew them with a rounded solidity that made them seem like authentic portraits. Norman Ferguson, who had come west from the New York studios, created the wolf and made him a sly, slobbering masterpiece of a villain. Walt stressed the need for a song to tie all the elements together, and that was the responsibility of Frank Churchill. He had dropped out of UCLA to play honky-tonk piano in Tijuana and Juarez bars, and became a radio and movie studio musician before being hired by Disney to arrange cartoon scores. For Three Little Pigs, he composed a jingle along the pattern of Happy Birthday to You, and storyman Ted Sears provided some couplets. "I build my house of straw, and I build my house of sticks." The chorus came naturally. Who's afraid? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? There seems to be no way to end the chorus until Pinto Colvig, who had portrayed many of the voices in the cartoons, played a phrase on the ocarina. Three Little Pigs breezed through production and was previewed with excellent results. Walt was elated, and he sent a message to his brother Roy in New York. "At last we have achieved true personality in a whole picture." Roy conveyed Walt's enthusiasm to the United Artists salesman. When a print of Three Little Pigs arrived in New York, Roy arranged a screening in a projection room at the United Artists office. The hard-boiled salesman remained silent during the cartoon, and one of them afterwards said, "This kind of a cheater, don't you think?" Roy asked what he meant. "The last cartoon Walt sent us was Father Noah's Ark with dozens of animals," said the salesman. "Now he gives us only 4?" The United Artists publicity man, Hal Horn, laughed and assured Roy, "This is the greatest picture Walt's ever made." The salesman's glum comments seemed to have been borne out when Three Little Pigs opened at the Radio City Music Hall. Audience found the cartoon amusing, but the personality of the pigs and the wolf failed to register on the music hall's mammoth screen. Only when Three Little Pigs started playing neighborhood theaters in New York did the explosion begin. Audiences everywhere were captivated by the pigs and joined in loathing the wolf. He, after all, was a symbol of the depression that had crimped everyone's lives. The song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, became a national rallying cry. The Disney organization was unprepared for the sudden success. The company had never had a song hit, and no contract had been made to publish Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. Orchestra leaders all over the country sent their arrangers to theaters to copy the tune and lyrics so the song could be played for audiences. Irving Berlin's music company sought permission to publish the song, and Roy entered into a contract. The success of Three Little Pigs was unparalleled in cartoon history. Theater marquees all over the country builded above the feature movies. First run houses changed their feature attractions but kept offering Three Little Pigs week after week. One New York theater played it so long that the manager drew beards on the pigs in the lobby poster. As the run extended, the beards grew longer. The United Artists salesmen responded characteristically. Their message to Walt was, "Send us more pigs!" He refused, never wanting to repeat himself, but Roy convinced him that bringing back the pigs would be good for business. Walt made three more: the Big Bad Wolf, Three Little Wolves, and the Practical Pig. None approached the sensation of the original, and Walt made a comment he repeated for years after: "You can't top pigs with pigs." On November 18th, 1932, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences gave its first award for a cartoon to Walt Disney for Flowers and Trees. He was also presented a special award for the creation of Mickey Mouse. His status as a maker of film entertainment had been officially acknowledged, and Walt was beginning to make a modest venture into Hollywood society through polo. He had taken up the sport with his usual thoroughness, encountering Jack Cutting in the studio hallway. Walt remarked, "I understand you're a good horseman. Would you like to play polo?" Cutting said he would. Walt also enlisted Norm Ferguson, Les Clark, Dick Lundy, Gunther Lessing, and Bill Contrell, and he even persuaded Roy to join. All were summoned to the conference room at the Hyperion studio, where they found pads, pencils, and copies of the text. Cameron's As to Polo. Walt had hired a polo expert, Gil Proctor, who lectured about maneuvers, plotting them on the blackboard. When the rudiments had been learned, the eight poloists began practice sessions at a riding academy in the San Fernando Valley. Practice started at 6 in the morning and was completed in time for all of the players to report the studio by 8. Walt erected a polo cage at the studio. On the lunch hour or during work breaks, the players could sit on a wooden mount and practice hitting the wooden ball. When their coach considered them well enough trained, they began competing in matches at Victor McLaughlin's studio on Riverside Drive. Walt and Roy later played at the Riviera Club with such figures as Will Rogers, Darrell Van Zanuck, Spencer Tracy, James Gleason, Big Boy Williams, and Frank Borzaga. Walt was not the best of players, but he was a hard-riding competitor, making up with aggressiveness for what he lacked in skill. In 1933, Walt and Lily moved into a new home that they had built in the Los Feliz district a few miles from the studio. It was a handsome house with a swimming pool dug out of the hard mountainside rock. Soon there would be a new arrival, as Walt wrote in a letter to his mother in Portland. "The doctor says Lily is in a perfect condition and everything is okay, and within a week or so everything will be over, except the crying. The spare bedroom where you and Dad stayed is all fixed up like a nursery. We have a bassinet and baby things all over the place. On the dresser, bed, and everywhere else are kinds of pinks and blue tinies that I don't know anything about. Really, it's quite a strange atmosphere to me. I can't conceive of it belonging to us. It seems all right for somebody else to have these things around, but not for us. I presume I'll have to get used to it, and I suppose I'll be as bad a parent as anyone else. I made a lot of vows that my kid won't be spoiled, but I doubt it. It may turn out to be the most spoiled brat in the country. I bought my baby a present last week. I found a nice half-thoroughbred mare, which I thought would make a wonderful present for my baby. Of course, I figured I could make use of it until the baby got old enough to use it. I will stable it and use it for polo until the youngster grows up and is able to take it over. Don't fall over dead when I tell you I have 6 polo ponies now. But after all, it's my only sin. I don't gamble or go out and spend my money on other men's wives or anything like that. So I guess it's okay. Anyway, the wife approves of it." The baby girl arrived on December 18th, 1933, 13 days after Walt's 32nd birthday. She was named Diane Marie Disney. I had no idea that the Three Little Pigs was such a important short. I mean, obviously, I've watched it. It's a great little bit. It's dark in places that I did not expect, especially the beginning scene where it has pictures of a picture of their father and it's cuts of meat. I cannot wait until next week when we read the next chapter, chapter 10. We are starting a new section at that point. Now, thank you for the time being. And remember, today's I apologize. One moment. Today's special moments make tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day.